Is there a God, and if so, what's he like?
Yeah, I do believe there is a higher power to your own understanding. I do believe it's kind of indescribable in a sense. It takes so many different forms and different shapes.
I believe God does exist, even though some people think it's questionable, but I still believe. Well, that's just the way I was raised.
I believe there is a higher being, whether it's a male or female is absolutely your choice of, gender, but I do believe there is a higher being.
I do believe there's a higher power out there. I'm not exactly into the idea of religion, but I do believe there's a higher power.
I spent 4 years of my life looking for the truth, and then I found Jesus Christ.
Personally, I haven't had any type of spiritual encounter or anything, but I was always instilled with the idea that he exists. I'm a bit questionable about it, but mostly overall I do believe in God.
So somebody somewhere designed us. We just don't know what it is, so we just give it a name of God.
I think there's always someone or some being upstairs. I think that a lot of different folks have different views on who that is or what that looks like.
Personally, I like to think there's some type of extraterrestrial life out there, that somehow we started because the universe is too big and too infinite. So, I definitely think that there's something out there.
I think God exists as long as you believe he exists. If you want to believe he exists, good for you. If you don't, also good for you. Who am I to judge?
Not necessarily like one being looking over everyone. I think it's more so in everyone, and we work our lives to find that in ourselves and through other people.
He's someone you can pray to. He's someone who's not present all the time, but he's someone who's there when you need him. He doesn't really control what happens in your life.
What is God like?
Okay, so I believe that there's we all have different encounters with we can have different encounters with God, It's just something that you have to experience and you have to be able to see for yourself.
God is like love. Love is like God in a sense.
I would answer that it's however you believe that he is.
I would say God is everywhere in everything because he's the one that's creating everything. Whether we believe it or not, these things didn't happen by themselves.
I feel like God's always with you. You never really get to know God. It's just a feeling. It's like you just know he's there.
I would describe God as telling my child to look in the mirror. God is all of us. We're from God. So if you want to know how he really looks, look in the mirror every day and you'll see him.
How is it that people can look at the same set of facts and share in the same experiences, yet come to very different conclusions about reality? Hi, my name is Jonathan Morrow, and as the Director of Cultural Engagement and one of the teaching faculty at Impact 360 Institute, I have the privilege of helping students and adults explore the biggest questions in life from a Christian perspective. I'm the father of 3. I've been married for over 15 years, and I'm honored to be your guide in this study. 3 things you need to know about me. First, I am not perfect. I am still in process just like you. Next, I'm a huge college football fan. And lastly, I think chips and salsa should be their own food group and have a privileged place on the food pyramid. With that settled, let's get started. In a very popular article on CNN entitled, "Why I Raised My Children Without God," a mom shares this. When my son was around 3 years old, he used to ask me a lot of questions about heaven. Where is it? How do people walk without a body? How will I find you? You know the questions the kids ask. For over a year, I lied to him and made up stories that I didn't believe about heaven. Like most parents, I loved my child so much that I didn't want him to be scared. I wanted him to feel safe and loved and full of hope. But the trade-off was that I would have to make stuff up, and I would have to brainwash him into believing stories that didn't make sense, stories that I didn't believe either. One day he would know this, and he would not trust my judgment. He would know that I built an elaborate tale, not unlike the one we tell children about Santa, to explain the inconsistent and illogical legend of God. When we raise kids without God, we tell them the truth. We are no more special than the next creature. We're just a very, very small part of a big, big machine. Whether that machine is nature or society, the influence we have is minuscule. Like any good mom, she wanted to comfort a small child who had big questions. But the stories she was telling him didn't make sense to her, and she didn't want to lie to her son. So she decided to tell her child what she thinks is the truth. You are not special, and your life is insignificant. Another example. Did you know that the average American household in 2015 carried $15,762 in credit card debt? And the total credit card debt owed by all U.S. consumers was $733 billion? That's a lot of money. But why do people spend so much more than they earn? What motivates them? What are the reasons? Especially given the fact that most report they don't like the feeling of being in debt. Or take the final film in the Divergent series, Allegiant. Beyond all the action scenes and special effects, this future apocalyptic story invites viewers to wrestle with some pretty significant questions. Should only the genetically pure be allowed to reproduce and rule society? Before you dismiss this as the stuff of science fiction, this is not as far-fetched as you might think. It's already medically possible to select for a certain gender and even eye color of your baby. In the not-too-distant future, parents will be given the option that for the right price, they can genetically enhance their baby to give her certain advantages in the world, like a higher IQ and more athletic ability, or even decrease the likelihood of certain diseases. But at what cost? These three examples all share one thing in common. They all flow from certain assumptions about reality. The mom who wants to raise her child without God, the paralyzing debt load that many Americans live with day to day, and the timeless quest for human perfection delivered by the promised savior of genetic engineering. All of them reveal the significance and relevance of worldview thinking to everyday life. Our worldview shapes the way that we see everything. Everyone has a worldview. It's unavoidable. But don't miss this. Most people are unaware that they even have a worldview. Through our worldview, we interpret life in a particular way. It affects how we think and how we feel and how we live from day to day. Worldviews matter. They matter for you, your friends, children, family, co-workers, and for our culture as a whole. It's why people can live in the same country and even the same house and have such different opinions about God, politics, truth, education, abortion, marriage, the environment, race, gender, economics, what it means to be human, and the origins of the universe, just to name a few. But these fundamental commitments, whether we're aware of them or not, significantly influence our perspectives and beliefs about these important issues and ideas. Our worldview is the unseen engine that drives our lives. Popular author and speaker Sean McDowell helps us begin our conversation on worldview by raising some important questions.
The word worldview is dropped a lot in Christian circles, and often I'll stop and I'll say to somebody, okay, what do you mean by worldview? And rarely do I have somebody actually say, okay, here's what a worldview is and what I mean by it. So it's important we understand what it is. I think a worldview is simply a view of the world. In other words, it's a perspective of reality. It's a belief system. Now, everybody has a worldview. It's not possible not to have a worldview. If you're thinking and breathing and living, we see the world in a certain way. The question is, are we aware of our worldview and why we hold those beliefs? And does our worldview actually match up with reality?
In these 8 sessions, we're going to explore worldview. We'll talk about what worldviews are and why they matter so much for how we live and relate to others, especially if you're a follower of Jesus. We're going to examine the major worldviews and then reality test them to see which best answers the biggest questions in life. Then we're going to develop what a Christian worldview looks like and explain the key factors necessary to build a strong and lasting worldview and have a positive, Christ-centered influence in our culture. After engaging the material in this study, you'll be equipped to better understand the challenging times in which we live, and you'll be prepared to recognize and resist the empty ideas championed by our culture. And you'll learn how to pass on a strong and enduring worldview to the next generation. Worldviews are everywhere, and unchristian worldviews are competing for the hearts and minds of this generation. So the question falls to us. Will we let those false ideas win? Or will we stand firm, as the Apostle Paul said 2,000 years ago, and not grow weary in doing what is good? Because at the end of the day, there are only 2 paths we can take. One towards life with God, who created and loves us, or one away from God and consumed with ourselves. As we look at our cultural moment today, I want to suggest that we need a dual focus. First, we must be sobered by the challenges of competing worldviews, but we also must remain optimistic about our opportunities for influence. We must have the courage to do what is right and necessary. As God commands us in His Word, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. This means we need to know not just what we believe, but why we believe it. Then we can arrange our lives around what matters most. So at the beginning of our study together, I want to share 6 biblical reasons we need to take worldview thinking and formation seriously. First, Christians are called to understand the times in which we live. In a passage in the often neglected book of 1 Chronicles, we learn about the sons of Issachar. Little is known about them other than that they were part of David's mighty men and had a unique but very important role to play. Of the sons of Issachar, men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do, their chiefs were 200 and all their kinsmen were at their command. 1 Chronicles 12:32. What I love about this passage is how matter-of-fact it is. No fluff. These men understood the times. In other words, they were aware of what was going on around them culturally, and they had knowledge of what Israel should do. This is not an isolated theme in the Bible. We also see the Apostle Paul on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. Acts 17, 16, and 17. Paul is observing what is going on in Athens. He's understanding the times so that he could better engage and reason with everyday people in the marketplace. Paul is living out the command he gave to his Colossian brothers and sisters in Christ. Conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Colossians 4:4-6. Again, we hear the echoes of Issachar in this passage. Understand the times so that you can make the most of the opportunities that God puts in your path. Second, Christians are called to understand our own worldview. I love how the New Living Translation translates 2 Thessalonians 2:15. With all these things in mind, dear brothers and sisters, stand firm and keep a strong grip on the teaching we passed on to you both in person and by letter. Notice that Paul assumes a body of teaching that has been delivered to them. There is distinctly Christian content that they are to keep a strong grip on. Therefore, as you have received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in Him, having been firmly rooted and now being built up in Him and established in your faith, just as you were instructed and overflowing with gratitude. Again, Christians are instructed and established in their faith. There are essential elements that they must understand or they will cease to be Christian in any meaningful sense. Third, Christians are not to be deceived and shaped by other worldviews. We are commanded to be on the lookout. We are called to play defense when it comes to other worldviews. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. Colossians 2:8. This passage is often misunderstood as teaching that philosophy or thinking hard is bad for your faith. This couldn't be further from the truth. What Paul is getting at here is that there's a lot of deceptive thinking out there not based on Christ. But the warning is clear: do not be taken captive. Ideas have consequences and we need to be alert. C.S. Lewis clarifies the issue. Good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. As we saw earlier, we need to be like the sons of Issachar when it comes to culture, but we also need to follow the example of the Bereans when it comes to the Bible. Now, the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. We must test the ideas we encounter against the ideas of Scripture. For the Christian, the Bible is God's revelation and our final authority. Knowing how easy it is for us to be subtly taken in and shaped by those around us, Paul gives this command to all Christ followers. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you'll learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Here's the bottom line. If we are not to be deceived, then we must think well and we must think Christianly. Fourth, Christians are to attack ideas that are hostile to the knowledge of God. Notice first that I said ideas are to be attacked and not people. As Robert Sirico of the Acton Institute has said, we need to be ruthless with ideas, but gentle with people. As we just established, we need to be ready to recognize and reject false worldviews. But we're also called to play offense when it comes to other worldviews too. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians 10, 3-4. What is a speculation? A speculation is a set of ideas, a theory, a way of thinking, a belief system. And I don't think it's a stretch to substitute the word worldview here. In 1915, Princeton theologian J. Gresham Machen prophetically warned that false ideas are the greatest obstacles to the reception of the gospel. We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there, if we permit the whole collective thought of a nation or of the world to be controlled by ideas which, by the resistless force of logic, prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. Given the state of our culture, both inside and outside the church, we have a lot of work to do. In a later session, we'll learn a reliable three-step method for testing worldviews that shows where and how competing worldviews fail the reality test. We need to go on offense without being offensive, to gently and humbly help others come to grips with the failure of any worldview that opposes the truth. Fifth, we are commanded to pass on our faith to the next generation. We will not hide these truths from our children. We will tell the next generation about the glorious deeds of the Lord and His power and His mighty wonders, so the next generation might know them, even the children not yet born, and they in turn will teach their own children, so each generation should set its hope anew on God, not forgetting His glorious miracles and obeying His commands. Psalm 78, 4-7. How will the next generation know unless we teach them? Unfortunately, students are not being prepared the way they need to be. They need a faith that answers the why questions in life. Nancy Pearcey captures the urgency here with crystal clarity. As Christian parents, pastors, teachers, and youth group leaders, we constantly see young people pulled down by the undertow of powerful cultural trends. If all we give them is a heart religion, it will not be strong enough to counter the lure of attractive but dangerous ideas. Young believers also need a brain religion, training in worldview and apologetics, to equip them to analyze and critique the competing worldviews they'll encounter when they leave home. If forewarned and forearmed, young people at least have a fighting chance when they find themselves a minority of one among their classmates or work colleagues. Training young people to develop a Christian mind is no longer an option. It is part of their necessary survival equipment. I couldn't agree more, and this is what I've dedicated my life to doing. Barna research shows that 59% of Christians will disengage from their faith during their college years. But it doesn't have to be this way. One of the ways to reverse this trend is giving students worldview and apologetics training. This is exactly what we're doing here at Impact 360 Institute. Whether through online courses like this or our 2-week Worldview and Apologetics training experience for high school students called Immersion, or our 9-month academic gap year for high school graduates, we are deeply committed to equipping the next generation with a biblical worldview. You can find out more about all that we have to offer teenagers and how we can come alongside you as parents and teachers at impact360.org. Giving the next generation a biblical worldview is not optional. Sixth, loving God with all of our minds is not optional for the Christ follower. Being a disciple, by definition, means being a learner. Here's Dr. J.P. Moreland, one of the most important Christian thinkers of our generation, on the importance of this.
Well, Jesus, in my view, and in the view of many, was the smartest man who ever lived. He was extremely intelligent and able to interact with the thought leaders of his day. Now, many people think of Jesus as kind of a 60s hippie who kind of wore sandals, drove a VW van, and slinked into town and dropped a few one-liners on people and laughed. And of course, Jesus was, in a sense, like that. He related to average people, to blue-collar workers, as my parents were, and he could relate. But he also could relate to the university professors of his day. And in Matthew 22, for example, from 31 to 39, Jesus is in the middle of a debate between the Harvard professors and the Princeton professors of his day. That would be the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who represented two streams of top intellectual thought of his day. And the debate was over life after death. Is there such a thing? And they tried to trick Jesus into stumbling in this debate and not being able to defend himself. So they asked him a trick question, and Jesus is quite able to debate and dialogue. He understood the issues, and he was very, very comfortable. So if we fast forward to today, what we would understand is that Jesus would feel very much at home with down and out people on Skid Row, but he would be very, very comfortable in a university environment holding a seminar for doctoral students on subjects of importance. Now, this is important because we want our children and in our own lives to imitate him. And we should imitate him as best we can in all of his practices. But that also includes we should imitate him in learning to love God with all of our minds, as he put it, and learning to be thoughtful. I had a friend tell me once, you would not expect following Jesus to require us to be thoughtless, would you? Don't you think following Jesus would ask of us a thoughtful approach? And as I thought about that, I said, well, of course. I want to be as thoughtful about following Jesus as I would about anything.
As Dallas Willard put it so well, Jesus is Lord can mean little in practice for anyone who has to hesitate before saying, Jesus is smart. He's not just nice, he's brilliant. He's the smartest man who ever lived. Being a disciple of Jesus includes thinking well and worshiping God with our minds. Here's the bottom line. The Christian mind is being eroded by the hollow ideas of our culture. We're told, buy more stuff and you'll be happy, and we hop on board. We're told that naturalism is true, and we say, okay, that makes sense. And we're informed that truth is relative, and we unwittingly agree. I deeply believe that to become who God calls us to be, we must move in our thinking from isolation to integration. This means that knowing what we believe is no longer enough. We must step out of this intellectual bubble and understand why we believe what we believe. We must first understand the ideas that oppose the truth. Then we must understand how the Christian view of reality is superior to everything else that's out there. In her outstanding book, Total Truth, Nancy Pearcey makes this penetrating observation. Our lives are often fractured and fragmented, with our faith firmly locked in the private realm of the church and family, where it rarely has a chance to inform our life and work in the public realm. The aura of worship dissipates after Sunday, and we unconsciously absorb secular attitudes the rest of the week. We inhabit two separate worlds, navigating a sharp divide between our religious life and our ordinary life. We are called to more than Sunday morning only Christianity. A generation of Sunday morning only Christians will not have the influence that we are called to have and our world desperately needs. And that's why worldview thinking and formation matters so much. In this session, we learned that everyone, whether they know it or not, has a worldview that affects the way we think, feel, and act. We also examined 6 biblical reasons for taking worldview thinking and formation seriously. Christians are called to understand the times in which we live, to understand our own worldview, to not be deceived and shaped by other worldviews, to attack ideas that are hostile to the knowledge of God, to pass on our faith to the next generation, and to love God with our minds, not just our hearts. This is not optional for the Christ follower. In our next session, we're going to deepen our understanding of what a worldview is by using an 8-question framework to explore the core of any worldview you might run into.